Are you afraid of blank canvas as much as I do? So let's start from the first step. So every project starts with the brief, the problem to solve. It can be external, like for example from a client or an art director, or it can be for a personal project. If the brief comes from a client, then that part of the work is already done. I already have an idea and I already have my problem to solve. If the project is personal though, I need to find the story by myself. Most of the time, when I'm not sketching mindlessly, I'm starting a project with words rather than sketches. This is because I need to find the purpose for the project. The storytelling part of the painting is what makes viewers engage with the artwork. So this is a free app called Concepts, and I find it for iPad, but I think it's available for Android as well. I use it to quickly block down my ideas, and I start with the main keywords, like the core values or visuals for the project. In this case, I really wanted to paint something with a fantasy element, but very much related to nature. After that, I write down all the links and connection of these two main concepts that come to mind. They can be something visual, they can be an idea, anything that comes to mind really. I was pretty sure I wanted to have woods and a forest and some kind of architectural or human element in it. I wasn't really sure on the fantasy magical element, but I figured that could come to mind along the way. Now, something that I always like to remind myself is thinking about storytelling. There are only a few exceptions where I'm not including storytelling in my scenes, and that is when I'm designing something. It could be a character or an environment or a prop. That doesn't need a story, that's just design. In this case though, I'm presenting a scene, a situation. So I'm thinking about the story and the situation. I'm asking myself, who is going to do what and when? Even if I'm only presenting just one frame, like in this case. My second step is putting together a mood board. I use a free desktop app to manage my boards and references called PureRef that I really recommend. You can lay out a series of images in the most comfortable way for you, and you can keep your references on overlay, like in a corner, while you're working, and that can be extremely useful. In this case, I'm not working on my computer though, I'm working on my iPad, so I'm just using it for the mood board. So I usually put together a series of external images that fits with the mood and style that I have in mind, or some realistic elements that can be useful as a reference to represent specific things, like the foliage, for example. Sometimes I just save an image because I just like the colors and I want to use them as references for the painting. The images you see on the mood board are not mine, and I usually look for inspiration externally to get out of my style and my comfort zone. Sometimes the reference that I input are photos that I took myself somewhere, like the woods images you can see here. You can either choose to do some sketches before putting together a mood board or after, depending on what you have in mind. In this case, I already had somewhat an idea of what I wanted to represent and how, so I started with references before sketching. But sometimes I prefer to sketch before looking externally because I don't want to influence myself too much. So when I'm done with my mood board and I have everything in place, I can go on sketching. But before starting, I want to briefly mention that for the whole project, I only use 3 brushes. The round brush from the painting folder, the flat brush for the big surfaces, and occasionally the airbrush. Now let's get into the thumbnails. Practically, what I do is just dividing my screen in a 3x3 grid, and I use these rectangles and mini canvases where I sketch quickly a few ideas using values. I keep them small in order to go as fast as possible and avoid getting caught up with the details, because at this stage I'm only looking for ideas and good composition. You could choose to work with sketches and line work for thumbnailing if you wish, but I find that value works well for me because they give me a better and immediate readability and allow me to see some depth in the scene even at such an early stage. Of course, working in values has its challenges. You kinda need to understand properly how to work with values and have some preparation and experience on that as well. That is a long topic and I'm gonna cover it in its own video. Anyway, the main purpose of thumbnails is not to have some pretty sketches, but to look for different ideas and designs. Obviously, if you need to present these ideas to someone else, they kinda need to be readable, but if it's a personal project, and as long as they serve you to find new compositions or a base for your painting, they can be done as quickly and rough as you want. Here you can see I'm looking for different camera angles, different environments, different feelings. The only thing that I have in common go back to my keywords that I wrote down in my brief phase. So some nature elements, maybe some kind of architecture and some magical elements. Sometimes I sketch in some characters, sometimes I don't. It doesn't really matter at this stage as they are not the main focus. Sometimes I isolate my sketch and some others I don't. It really depends on the thumbnail. But toward the end, I kinda wanted to give them all the same basic values, so I keep them all visible to avoid fluctuating with different moods. When I finally got some ideas out of my system, I can pick the one that I like the most. So I chose the lazy option and I brought this thumbnail to a bigger canvas to enlarge it and make it to a decent size. I don't usually take the thumbnail and use it as a base of my painting because being just a sketch, I just don't worry to make it correct. For example, both values and perspective are very likely to be off. And sure enough, in this case, they kinda are, but I thought they were holding well enough for now. Obviously, because this is a raster image, enlarging it like that results in a very low res, and we need to fix that, but it gives me a good enough base for my layout and values. Now I'm going to paint over the basic sketch on a separate layer, and I'm going to pass through the whole image in order to match it with my current image size, and that should solve the resolution problem. I'm picking the values from the sketch underneath, although there's something on this we will need to adjust, but we are going to worry about that later. So little by little I repaint the whole image using values. I'm taking into account both basic values of any surface as well as the base ambient light. Painting the base with a generic ambient light is good, because it means we are not committing to anything yet, and we can take a more specific decision on lighting later on. Now, after I finished painting on top of my base sketch, I find that the values aren't working properly. The rocks in the foreground and the hut stands out properly, but everything that is in the middle has kind of the same value and the rocks are lost with their surroundings. So sometimes a good solution to this is editing the curves, so let's try that. The curves feature is present in all major painting softwares. This is Procreate, but I've used it on Photoshop before as well as Krita. In order to edit my value curves correctly, I need to copy my image on another layer because I need to have everything in one layer. As you can see, this edit potentially all my values, so I need to edit them carefully in order to still keep the image correctly readable. Although in this case, this doesn't seem to solve my problem as the rocks are still lost with their surroundings. So I think I can solve the problem manually, so let's cut them out and edit their values separately. I'm gonna take the lasso tool, copying them on a separate layer and editing the curves. Now our base values for the painting are finally in place. Okay, we can finally start talking about color. Before going on coloring my painting though, let's think a little bit about color choices. Let me explain. This is the color wheel. It's something that has been used to explain color theory for a long time, and I can use it to explain my choices as well. Color affect our mood and our perception of a piece based on their combination. So for example, we can choose colors that are all close together on the wheel, and so they are very similar between each other. And this will create an harmonious effect. We can also choose only one color, if we like, and make a monochromatic composition. This will result in something very similar to a value composition, to be honest. If we select two colors that are on the opposite side of the wheel, these two colors are called complementary with each other, and they create a very high contrast effect. Basically, the contrary of having similar colors that generate harmony effect instead. This is exactly what I need for this piece because I want a very vibrant vibe. So let's go ahead and see how to add colors to my value composition. I don't want to lose my precious values, so let's add another layer, and in the layer settings, let's select color blending mode instead of the default normal one. As we saw in my previous video on how to paint from value to color, changing the layer settings changes how the layer interacts with what's visible underneath. So if we select the color blending mode, we are only adding hue to our value without modifying them. Now I can add my basic colors, keeping in mind that the two main colors are the opposites of the color wheel. This doesn't mean I can't add other colors, but that I can use these two as mains and general guidance for the overall feel of the painting. Remember, these are just the base colors and the scene is going to look a bit ugly for a while. And that's why adding colors after values often doesn't seem to work. We need to make some work on top because right now a lot of things are still missing. Speaking about what's missing, we really need to add our main lighting, as right now we only have a basic ambient light given by our values. So this scene is set during the day, and I'd like to think it's the middle of the day, so the sunlight is coming pretty much from directly above. Now repainting on top of our base everything that is hit directly by the sunlight would be a bunch of work. So I'll hack this one with a method that I find very convenient and that I often use. Let's copy my entire scene on a new layer and let's edit it as if everything is hit by sunlight. So I'm going to edit the curves and rise them up. so everything looks brighter. And then I'm going to edit the color balance so that everything looks a bit warmer compared to the shadows. Now we find ourselves with a sunlight layer and a shadow layer. If I add another layer between the two and make the sunlight layer a mask of this new one, the sunlight will only be visible where something is visible on this layer. So the result of this is that I can literally paint the sunlight on top of my painting. I'm going to paint it on everything where the light hits. So probably any upper facing surface and everywhere where the foliage from the trees doesn't block it. What I love about this method is that it gives me absolute flexibility because I can paint the light or erase it without losing everything that is on my light layer. I can even adjust the brightness or the color of the light after I paint it in. So I can tweak the light effect exactly as I want it and whenever I want it. So this is how we paint the light in the overall image. And now we painted our main light source. But this is not the only light source affecting our painting. We need to consider other sources. When we have a daylight scene such as this one, we can actually consider the sky as a secondary source of light. This secondary light is going to project a general blue ambient light coming from above. But because this light is way less intense than our primary source, we are not going to be able to see its impact in the areas where our sun is brightening the surface. Instead, we are going to see it in all the areas in the shadows that are exposed to it. So likely all the upper facing surfaces like the roof of the hut or the top of the rocks or the grass. Try to think where logically this light is likely to influence the surface, and if you struggle, you can always go back and look at some references. Now the technique I'm using to paint the blue skylight on the surfaces is exactly the same as the sunlight one. But this time I'm going to brighten up my layer much less and I'm balancing my colors toward blue instead. I'm also placing the blue sky layer underneath the sunlight ones so I don't risk to have some blue light appearing where the sunlight is. And as you can see, I avoid painting the secondary light close to tight spaces or where something is facing downwards and away from the light. Okay, so now we have pretty much the base for our painting coming together, and we can start thinking about the character. As we have seen previously, when adding my character to the scene, I need to think about the story behind what is it that I'm representing. So I ask myself who is doing what and when, and I think about a couple of ideas that might work. So I place a white layer in a low opacity on the scene to give myself some room to be able to sketch on top and start sketching some ideas. This is not the way I ideally design a character. I would usually do some research, thumbnails, etc. But the characters in this scene are not my main concern, and this is still a personal project, so let's cut some corners here. I thought about a girl at first, but I decided to settle on a boy instead, as I tend to draw too many girls typically, and I'm trying to get out of my comfort zone. So I draw my characters in base color and the same old trick for the sunlight, hitting them as well. Now that we have added all these things, we can see that observing our image, something is still missing. And I keep having this sense that the image is somewhat fake. What is missing is ambient light and ambient occlusion. Let me explain. When light hits a surface, such as our sunlight on the grass, for example, parts of it gets absorbed and some other part get reflected and bounces back, scattering around. And in doing so, this brings with itself a good part of the color of the surface. So some green from our grass will get reflected somewhere, as well as some blue from the water, some gray from the rocks, or even some red from the roof. And where are all these colors bouncing? Usually not too far away. They are reflecting on the surfaces that are in proximity and are facing my bouncing light. This is because bounce light loses a lot of intensity from the bounce, as part of it gets absorbed in the first place. To understand how to paint this bounce light, we have to take into consideration another factor though, and this is called ambient occlusion. Ambient occlusion refers to places where light is occluded and its passage gets blocked. This results in deep shadow areas, and we can often see this happening where two surfaces meet, generating a tight area. These two surfaces have areas more open to the environment where light can pass liberally, while as they get closer together, it gets harder for the light to penetrate. So based on this, I guess that I'm going to paint the ambient occlusion in tight areas, such as this area of the roof or the places generates by the rocks. So I'll go on and paint all these details in with the ambient occlusion and the bounce light around. Also, I noticed that because it's broad daylight and it's probably also pretty warm, I'm going to remove the smoke coming from the chimney by painting over it. Now, with a small brush, I'll also go to the image painting textures where I need, in order to make every material more believable, like grass, the rocks, or the roof. One last thing missing. Finally, in the last step, we need to give our painting one more touch of believability. And to do so, I want to talk about depth of field. Our eyes can see at incredible distances, but for us to make sense of the images that we can see in front of us, we can set focus on a specific area and blurring everything else. Camera lenses work pretty much in the same way, so we can check the effect on a lot of photographic materials. So we can divide our cone of view in an in-focus area, where we can see the image sharply, and an out-of-focus area, where we can see the image pretty much blurred. Now, how do we apply this concept to our image? Firstly, I decide which area will be in focus, which will be the most important area of my painting and the one that I can see sharply, which for this painting will be the central area where my characters are. So I need to blur everything else. But because my foreground and my background are in two different distances, I choose to apply the blurring effect differently on each. So I copy my canvas and I go to adjustments. I choose Gaussian blur and I apply the amount of the effect that I want. Then I erase everything but the foreground and I have my blur effect done for that part. So I do exactly the same for the background, but this time I apply the effect at a lower intensity. And this is it. Our painting is done. I hope this was useful and everything was clear. If you have any questions, please feel free to drop it in the comment section and I'll do my best to reply to everyone. And of course, if you enjoyed this tutorial, smash the like button and subscribe for more. Thank you for watching and I'll see you next time.